Kia ora. My name is Jan Woodhouse. I'm the chair of the New Zealand Institute of Landscape Architects Education Foundation. I'd just like to say a very big welcome to you all, and also to thank Auckland Conversations and all their sponsors, the banners around the room, for making this event possible. And now I'm going to ask Gavin from Isthmus Group to introduce Kathryn Moore, our speaker. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon. It's my pleasure to introduce Kathryn. I heard Kathryn talk last night at a different session at Unitec, and we're in for an intriguing and insightful presentation. Now, Kathryn is a designer, she's a philosopher, and she's an educator. So currently she is the Professor of Landscape Architecture at Birmingham City University. She's the visiting Arnold Weddell Chair at the University of Sheffield. She's recently published a book on design thinking, and that's titled Beyond the Visual, Demystifying the Art of Design. She's the president of IFLA, which is the International Federation of Landscape Architects. She is a juror for a number of international competitions, and that includes such projects as the Olympic Velodrome in London and the Uedi Riverside Park in Seoul. But principally she's a practicing designer, or perhaps it's more accurate to describe it as a leader of projects which bridge the design disciplines. And so you'll see that from her projects, that they bridge landscape, architecture and urban design. And notably, she set up and led the design team at Birmingham City Council. And projects during that time included the Salford Quays brownfields redevelopment, which is a major urban renewal project in Birmingham. The East City Park, which also was a catalyst project for urban renewal in the city centre, and the urban vision for the Black Country. And for those of you who know the Midlands, that's a major sort of post-industrial area. So the project she was involved with there was, essentially what we would call a regional spatial plan. And more recently, and in particular, her design input and advocacy on the HS2 high-speed rail line between London and Birmingham. Now, just to put that into context, HS1 is the Eurostar line between St Pancras and the Channel Tunnel that links into the European high-speed rail network. And HS2 will extend that initially to Birmingham and subsequently to Manchester and Leeds. So it's a new corridor. Phase 1, which is 200 kilometres, that's in the order, there's a whole range of prices, of costs that I've seen, but the most consistent one seems to be in the order of about 35 billion New Zealand dollars. So to put that into context, that's about 35 transmission gullies. And Kathryn's conviction in relation to that project and to other projects is that design can make a fundamentally better and more economically valuable outcome. So she talks in her talk about redesigning the areas through which infrastructure runs, rather than simply dealing with the infrastructure itself. So making an engineering project into a landscape and urban renewal project. So I was invited to introduce Kathryn, I think, because I've been involved in a number of infrastructure projects. Some of them have turned out well, some of them seem to be a race to the bottom. So I look forward to Kathryn's perspective on getting to the bigger picture.
Kia ora, that's right. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me here today. It's a great pleasure to be in New Zealand. I've been here, I think 4 days, 5 days. I'm not entirely sure which day it is. But it's a real pleasure to be here. And everybody's been incredibly hospitable, so thank you so much for everybody who's been looking after me, shepherding me around all over the place. I want to talk a little bit about philosophy and theory and practice in that order, and to explain the basis of my work. I need to explain a little bit about my background. I did a degree, foundation course in art and design in Brighton, and then I went on to do a degree in geography at Manchester University. And then halfway through that course, I discovered landscape architecture. But the thing that's really, I realised as I've been asked to explain, well, where do your ideas come from? The thing that was really significant to me is growing up in this place, which is in Porthcawl on the South Wales coast. And so because I grew up there, I got used to looking always at the horizon, because the horizon is like a big meteorological clock. You can see the winds coming from the southwest as they do there, to know what sort of weather we were going to get. If it was coming, if I could hear the noise from the east, then I knew it was going to be a different type of weather. By the position of the sun, you could automatically know what time of day it is, what to expect next, where the way things are going to go. And that's absolutely important to me. Not only in fact, I've designed my garden. I now live as far as you possibly can from the sea in Birmingham. So my garden is like an intersection of, like a big sundial, really. So I can use that to actually measure where the clouds are coming, because I miss having the horizon. But it's given me that perspective of looking beyond, always looking beyond the boundaries, looking into the distance. And I think that's really significant to the work that I've done since then. Once I discovered this thing called landscape architecture, I did a postgraduate degree at Manchester University. I got a job at Salford City Council, and for the derelict land reclamation team. And I don't know whether any of you know Salford at all, but there was so much derelict land there that people would fall about laughing when they knew that I'd got this job, because it seemed like it would be the job of a lifetime. You'd never finish. And this is one of the key projects that I worked on, which I'll return to later. But while I was there, there were 3 of us to start with, and then there ended up being about 24 in the team, and I was appointed to be the group leader for the whole landscape group. And the chair of the Planning and Development Committee came up to me, and he'd watched my progress since the time I started. And he came up and he nudged me and he said, "Well done, lass. Head girl now." And I thought, yes. And he said, "But why does it all look the same?" And I thought, oh, God, he's right. We've done so much, but it does all more or less look similar. You know, there's like a green swathe emerging across the city. And there are all sorts of reasons why it was like that. It was to do with the funding that we had. We only had £5 per square metre, and that's why our environment zone looked different from the Oxford Science Park, where they had about £120 per square metre. But I realised that there's still something more that needed addressing. So when I took over as group leader, I decided to change the priority from getting the money spent by the end of the year, which is what most local authorities in the UK certainly concentrate on. You've got to get the money spent. To actually looking at the quality of the work. I started talking to people about their designs, why they designed it that way, why they'd chosen a particular path, what they were hoping to achieve. And I realised that they were really, really uncomfortable about talking about that. They didn't like me asking those questions. They didn't like, it was almost like, how dare you ask me? And also, I don't know what to say. So we ran a series of CPD events to try and improve things, and they sent me on CPD events for the things that they didn't like that I did. But then when the job came up at Birmingham, I decided that it was really time to put my money where my mouth was and to actually move into education, because that's where it all starts. whilst I was there, I have to say, although it's not evident, that I have quite a good ecological background and had fantastic projects, including a 25-year management plan for Salford, which was hugely controversial, but actually quite successful. And that taught me an awful lot about time, working with people, having that longer view again, thinking about how to actually introduce design into woodland management. When I moved into teaching, I thought, right, this is great, this is my chance to sort it out. I'll get the book that tells me how to teach design. And for those of you in education, you'll know that there isn't a book that tells you how to, well, there wasn't then, that tells you how to teach design. And so I thought rather optimistically that I would write a book. I started the first article that was I got published. A couple of days after it came out, I got a letter. For those of you, I don't know whether any of you recognise the gentleman on the right-hand side, but it was from him, and he said, "Dear Miss Moore, congratulations on your article. I would very much like to come and see the work of your students, in brackets, at my own expense. Yours sincerely, Sir Geoffrey Jellicoe, OBE." So I nearly fell over. I couldn't believe it. I went running down, look at this. You know, it's just amazing to get it. And so, of course, I was really worried about him coming because he was quite ancient at that time. And I was, what if something happens to him while he's up in Birmingham? What if it's the last journey he ever makes? I mean, it was quite a nerve-wracking experience. And I said to the students, right, look, he's very frail, he's very old. I don't want anything, mustn't excite him too much because we have to be really careful about what might happen. And I said, so you pin your work up, and then I'll tell him about the projects, and then if he wants to see you, I'll come and get you. So, as the students took absolutely no notice of this, and they came up through the floorboards, ran in through the windows, up through the doors, and soon there were 30 or 40 of them hanging on his every word, and he was absolutely brilliant. Because of that, I mean, just very briefly, but because of that, I was then invited to his, after he died, obviously, I was invited to speak at his memorial address, which was a couple of years later. Which was a very nerve-wracking experience at the Royal Academy. When the taxi dropped me there, I realised, oh my goodness, it is the Royal Academy. I thought it might be a sort of a smaller version of one somewhere in London. And then that led to, I received an invitation to stand for council for the Landscape Institute, and then became president of the Landscape Institute. But really, I say all this because it's his vision that set up IFLA in the first place after the Second World War, and really he's the reason why I became the IFLA president and accepted the nomination with great pleasure. So since I've done various things at Birmingham, including designing a new undergraduate programme and running the postgraduate courses. But the main thing that I've done is to actually, it is the main thing I've done, is to write a book which took 15 years to write. It's not recommended to take that long over it, but there you go. And the main thing is that I'm passionate about design. I always have been. And I'm equally passionate about finding new ways to raise the academic credibility of the discipline. How can we demonstrate the expertise required to design well? So what I look at in this book is a way to actually, the subtitle, I guess, could be The Greeks Got It Wrong, talking about perception. So I'm actually suggesting that we should redefine theories of perception to actually which gives us a completely different perspective on life. If you look at this drawing here, that's Descartes' vision of the sense-datum theories of perception, and this is a modern interpretation of it from Richard Gregory. Now, you know the process. The idea is that what you touch, for example, if I touch this, the idea is that the senses somehow sense that, or whatever it is you're looking at, or feeling, or hearing, and then somehow it's processed, crystallized, or synthesized in order to serve intelligence. And that's this, it's referred to here as a hidden layer. or a black box, the sensory interface, sensory mode of thinking, the haptic, the visual, perception, the mind's eye, creativity, the subconscious. I mean, the thing that lies just underneath understanding. It's called all sorts of things. Nobody really quite knows how it works at all. So my suggestion is that this is actually a philosophical misconception. And the problems that we have to do with thinking that we can teach design, the problems that we have to do with the academic credibility of arts and design education and all those sorts of issues, all the dualities that we're faced with all the time that are part of our culture, come back to this basic picture here that has set the scene that nobody's really investigated very much over recent years. So I think the book articulates a philosophical argument that reframes the relationship between the senses and intelligence, and this is what challenges many of the ideas underlying art and design education. So what I try to do in there is to translate philosophical ideas into simple language that demonstrating their practical implications as well as the philosophical lessons that can be learned from practice. And this is what begins to create a new discourse, not a new language, but a new way of speaking about landscape or design or art by overlaying and cutting across concepts that have been compartmentalized and segregated so successfully over time that they've become part of life. We take them to be common sense, as I'm suggesting that it isn't. So the philosophical basis is quite simple. For the first time, one of the main preoccupations of contemporary cultural discourse, which is the argument for or against the idea of a universal truth, is carried into the perceptual realm. And that questions the very nature of foundational belief. And it's that argument that actually enables us to question the existence of a sensory interface, however it's characterized, which Hilary Putnam describes as a disastrous idea that has haunted a disastrous idea that has haunted Western civilization since the 17th century. And I suppose the key of it is, instead of thinking that perception is really close to intelligence, as people are beginning to talk about, many people have suggested this, that actually perception is intelligence. And that's that pivotal move is what changes the whole picture. Now, the fallout from this is far-reaching and profound. It provides the basis for a strong conceptual and artistic rationale for arts education. It strips out the metaphysical dimension of perception, which is the thing that mystifies the art of design. Well, all sorts of things. And it shows that the design process is actually a critical endeavour at every stage, not a mystical experience. And it enables us to talk about design more sensibly. It has a number of implications, of course. In terms of philosophy, I've looked to set a different agenda for philosophy, making the point that theory and philosophy need not necessarily be metaphysical by nature. Of course, there's all sorts of really interesting philosophy that is metaphysical by nature, but that's not the only way to go. There are alternative sets of beliefs to work with. Theory does not have to depend on French or German philosophy, the philosophy of language, notions of identity, difference, self, subject, truth or reason, or, most crucially, the impossibility of anything. This work also has implications for research. Redefining the relationship between the senses and intelligence not only makes any and every part of the design process accessible to investigation, but it's also clear that the limits to any kind of inquiry are governed only by our knowledge and experience. So responsibility for understanding what sense we make of the world is handed back to us. There's nothing else to help you to make a decision. No firm, fixed end point of inquiry. No genius loci to speak to you if you look long and stare long and hard enough to find it. So this is one of my favourite surprisingly, favourite images. This is the Manchester method of landscape evaluation. So this was developed, I think the project culminated with this in 1975, just at the point at which the statistical revolution and the quantitative revolution was beginning to be challenged. And so I have no idea how much this research project cost, but it was really significant. And I tried to get hold of this for several years, and in the end, one of my students who worked up at the university handed it to me in a brown paper bag and said, "This is what you want." So this is it. But this is a very dry, reductive equation, a number crunching analysis, and that is as full of preconceptions and presumptions as something that is very phenomenological, such as the work of Stephen Hall, and in looking at the questions of perception. These images are that he's presented here, or the old ways of seeing, which is by Jonathan Hale, who suggests that we need to recapture an old way of seeing, but you can't learn it, you just have to get it through osmosis or being close to it somehow. Both of them are equally full of presumptions and preconceptions. They're both actually the same side, two sides of the same coin. So if you look at the debates, to also make the point, if you look at the debates related to climate change, it's easy to see how open to interpretation facts can be, let alone finding any consensus as to what is an actual fact and what isn't. So working without depending on the concept of universal truth, pre-linguistic starting points of thought, sensory modes of thinking, this releases us from this endless debate between positions that are natural or cultural, classical versus romantic, scientific or artistic, theoretical from practical, value-laden from quantitative. We can just begin to have a completely different discussion and different discourse. I'm just going to have some images from my students' work from undergraduate and postgraduate as I talk about the impact that it has on the design process, because it actually impacts on the role of drawing and technology and theory and meaning, recognising that perception and language are interpretative, both of them. It's like removing a blindfold. So this is the final radical shift that enables us to understand one of the most obscure aspects of the whole design process, and that's of generating form. Demonstrating the indivisibility of ideas, theory, expression, and technology in practice. Realising that it is as impossible to design without concepts as it is to talk without a tongue. And that reminds me of when I was an external examiner up at Sheffield some years ago. One of the students was sort of quite triumphant when they said to me, "Well, I'm doing the landscape planning option, therefore I don't have to have a concept." And I thought, I wonder how that works. It means that we can have sensible discussions about the making of informed, imaginative and often difficult design decisions, making it clear that there's nothing magical or mysterious about it, because these decisions, although they're tricky, are actually the nuts and bolts of the process, an artistic rationale, if you like. And the impact that it has in the studio is quite simple. It's a matter of consistently asking why things look like they do. Asking what ideas are being worked with, what they look like, why they're appropriate given the site, brief and the context, what spatial principles are being expressed, whether at a strategic level or at a detailed level. It's about seeking an explanation as to why a particular kind of materiality is involved, whether it's light, shape, form, texture, what quality of experience is being shaped and for what kind of user. It's about encouraging students to plunge wholeheartedly into the visual spatial world, working with ideas, space, form and materiality. And for many students, especially postgraduate students who've never taken the visual world seriously, this is actually quite a scary thing until they begin to do it, and then they realise it's not that complex after all. Also in the studio, it's about developing moves and tactics to discourage the habitual decisions that students often make, often fall back on. And these are often presumed to be instinctive or intuitive, and instead pushing and challenging them to go further, developing their confidence to know which line of inquiry to follow, supporting risk-taking and challenging both our own and our students' preconceptions. And above all, it's crucial to avoid the presumption that anything visual or spatial or conceptual is self-evident. They need to support each other. Now, this is what introduces this critical element into the into design education, not just the theory and the technology that we're more familiar with. And it really helps to democratize the process, because from a student's point of view, what they can do is actually stand up and lead the critic to a certain extent. It shifts the balance of power. Instead of being left with that sinking feeling that they're missing something, that indefinable something that they hope they might get if they're lucky enough to get it, students are able to start working confidently with ideas and expressing them within the medium or within the brief. And they realise that progressing their skill is a question of learning, not voodoo. And now, no one's suggesting that every student will become a brilliant designer. But at least everyone stands an even chance of learning how to design, which has to be better than being led to believe that it's an inherent or an innate gift, ability, a gift that you might never manage to open. This perspective also provides a new view of landscape, because variously championed, especially and underestimated, the real worth of landscape continues to be a contentious and an emotive issue. It's the same here, I gather, as well. It seems to belong to all of us, but actually to no one. It's fragmented into different elements. It's the responsibility of numerous agencies, NGOs and departments. Its potency and complexity is often all too often overlooked within the development process. It's generally thought to be... I thought my screen had gone blank again. It's okay. We generally think that landscape is biodiversity, ecology or technology. And of course it is that. It is the physical context in the towns and the cities, but it's not just these things. It is about the national parks and the forests and the woodlands, and the constructed public realm. Gardens and allotments, the places that we create to watch the world go by. But significantly, from this different perspective, the landscape reflects our memory and values, the sense of pride that we have in the places where we live. This is Birmingham, where, a few years ago you wouldn't have gone down to this place. It's been completely transformed, and it's really given the city a lift. So it's the experiences that we have of a place, whether we're citizens or employees or students, and the landscape is about ideas, and it's the expression of these ideas that shapes the quality of our experience. If you think about where you grew up and how important that is to your sense of identity, how relevant and absolutely part of your culture that is, then you get to think about the landscape in a completely different way. It's not just the physical stuff, it's the relationship a community has with the landscape, with your surroundings, with your physical, social, cultural context. Now, actually trying to understand, so that means that it's no longer a survey that you go out to have a look at what's out there. You have to try and understand the relationship that people have with the land. Is a question of trying to find out the narratives that are passed down from grandparents to parents to kids. Try and understand the things that happened millennia ago, centuries ago, things that happen, or how the land is used over a yearly cycle, over the daily cycle, so that you begin to get a much richer picture of the complexity of this relationship. Some of the work that I've been doing recently has been with the University of Auburn, Birmingham, Alabama, with Birmingham. And we had the mobile drawing studio come over to talk to some kids from Witten. So this is Spaghetti Junction, which is this absolutely extraordinary interchange in Birmingham, built in the 70s. Big industrial area and this small housing area where the school is there. And we got the kids to think about the River Tame. They didn't even know it was there. It's not far from there. To imagine that they were, to actually begin to talk about it, to think about the river, which is extraordinarily important. And a revelation to them. They'll never forget that project, and they'll never forget the significance of the river in their community. So, whilst maintaining this arc between philosophy, theory, and practice, I'm exploring how this radical new approach can impact on other disciplines in order to affect the material change in the creation of to effect a material change in the kind of quality environments that are now expected by society. And key to this work is the breaking down of traditional conceptual and professional and institutional silos, looking at how we can operate and conceptualize without ideas, without relying on the notion of a sensory interface, investigating the implications for theory and practice when we abandon these resistant and arcane philosophical constructs. So this is having quite an impact beyond the academy. Landscape architecture, for example, is being increasingly recognised as a broad cultural, ecological and artistic discipline. And leading practitioners are recognising that, or understanding that, economic sustainability and cultural identity are as much a part of their remit as raising aspirations and expressing ideas through technologies. And I think it's sort of, at the moment, this is falling into four broad areas that I see as being very strategic opportunities. One is, for example, is in terms of leadership. And one of the most dramatic outcomes of this research is the way that it's helped me to lead and shape the policy work being undertaken for IFLA for an international landscape convention. And by focusing on this relationship that people have with the landscape, it means that we can begin to talk about the landscape in a way that helps to make it more resilient and tangible in the face of the development pressures, in the face of development pressures, and significantly in looking at the global challenges that we're all faced. The reason why UNESCO and United Nations agencies are interested in this is because they currently deal with the best landscapes, the most special, the elite landscapes, or the elite marine areas and heritage buildings and all those. They've got lists and areas that are delineated, that are protected in one way or another. But what this convention does, the ILC does, is to focus on the everyday landscape, because at the moment nobody's championing that. It's a way, we hope, if it gets through, is to actually give communities a means to articulate the significance of their landscape for them in the face of these development pressures. And of course, it's also giving, in terms of these sorts of pressures that we're all facing, the idea migration, the disasters such as, why would anybody build a nuclear power station on a fault line? Or the flooding issues. This is in England, in Tewkesbury. This is the cathedral in Tewkesbury, and you can see, if you wanted to keep your feet dry 2 years ago when we had such flooding, you'd go and find a medieval monastery, because they knew where to build where it wasn't going to get wet. But this is actually this is the town centre at the same time, and we've sort of forgotten the land, forgotten the significance of these larger scale issues, hydrology, geology. We're too focused on working within the red line. Drought, these are challenges that we're all facing, that we all have to deal with, and the ILC is a mechanism to help people to articulate this, and forestry, deforestation as well as forestation. So it's it's recognising that the relationship that communities have with the landscape is as powerful in the ordinary landscape as it is with these very prestigious landscapes that are on the lists that they have. And it's also helping them to overcome the institutional boundaries that they have between nature on one side, nature and science, and culture and arts. So that's why it's giving them a way to work across these institutional silos. And it's giving them, the other thing that's significant is that there are well-researched arguments, reasons for valuing the landscape of everyday life. And so that's why they're considering making a law to support that. And so we have support from many of the other UN agencies that you can see there. And we're, Di Menzies is working to have one for the APR, for the Asia Pacific region. I don't know if she's here today, but she was there last night. And so I urge you to all support that. And we have in Africa, there a lot of the national the nations there are working together to create one for Africa, and we've got there are 12 countries in Latin America that have signed, and national associations that are beginning to argue for a convention in Latin America and Canada. So it's really begun to gather momentum. About a year ago, I wasn't sure it would because everything went a bit quiet, and now I'm just absolutely amazed by what's happening. So this actually also, it is influencing educational policy. I won't go through this really. I'll just to mention that it's offering a very expanded form of practice, of design practice, and that's included in this thing to the International Labour Organization in 2008, which they didn't like because as far as they're concerned, landscape architects plant trees and run contracts, but we're saying no, it's actually a much broader remit than that. And we have and we're looking at having a UNESCO Charter for Education as well, which is in development at the moment. But running parallel with these policy legislative and policy initiatives, there's evidence of a sea change in planning and development hierarchies, with the landscape being seen as the lead driver, an important economic and social concern that's firmly on the mainstream political agenda. And so I've been looking at the large-scale regional design. That person who said, well, I don't need a concept, really struck a chord with me. So we looked at redesigning Washington, for example, when I was at Thomas Jefferson Chair, and various other things that we've been doing in the studio with the students for some time. And I wanted to return to Salford because this is also, if you have this expanded realm of field of design practice, I would include in that the policy work that we're doing with UNESCO. I would also say that a really important part of that is advocacy, and it's also raising aspirations and having this long-term view. So, for example, this was the image I showed you earlier. This was Salford when I got there. This is what it looked like, the image on the right, and we were told it was going to be a new water quarter for Salford, and we thought, oh, never happen. And then I was reminded when they said we can't understand why the university, why the BBC has relocated to Salford. They used to say that that kings make cities, perhaps we should say that politicians do. And we said no, it's actually because this project here, that we had a vision 25 years ago that's transformed the place. It's not perfect, but it's certainly better than it was. And also part of this larger vision is to understand how significant it is to use quality environments to attract inward investment. This is Sant Cugat de Val, which is just outside Barcelona, where this park was put in order to attract the development. And up until the financial crash, it was regarded as the green city, fastest growing area outside Barcelona. Everybody wanted to live there. East Side Park, which is opposite, just very close to outside the building where I work, it cost £11 million to develop, and it's already attracting £131 million of development adjacent to it. And so this is all the context that I began to look at HS2 landscape vision. It's HS2 landscape vision. I don't actually say landscape vision because, again, people assume that I'm just talking about trees, which you'll see that I'm not. I don't sometimes even say that I'm a landscape architect when I go in there because they will assume I'm just planting the trees, whereas I'm not. But it seemed to me that when I knew about this project, the government were talking about it in the wrong way. they were saying it's going to knock off 25 minutes from the journey time between London and Birmingham. And I just thought that doesn't really make much difference to anybody. I don't really think it's that relevant. So I went to see the head of planning and transportation at Birmingham City Council and said, this project, I'm not talking about whether it goes ahead or not, I'm not interested in those arguments, but if it does go ahead, you need to employ me for 2 years. So he laughed. He didn't employ me for 2 years, but we went out for a cup of coffee every 2 weeks for 6 months, at which time I was talking to him about the opportunities there are if we could see that it was a landscape-led transformation, a way to think about the economic and social transformation of the region as a whole, rather than a 60-metre wide corridor between Birmingham and London. So what I've been talking about since is a new way of delivering infrastructure, something that's multidisciplinary. It's completely interwoven strategies to do with social, spatial, cultural and economic dimensions. It's absolutely about increasing aspirations for the region and a commitment to change. It's looking at how it can be used to achieve a transformational change. So it's not just getting it finished and then sorting out the problems afterwards, but actually thinking about if we have a plan for the region as a whole, a spatial plan that's shared across various organisations and stakeholders, then we can work together to achieve a much more significant change. So it's looking at different economic models, not just how much does it cost, which is what the Treasury have been talking about for the last 3 years. You know, you've got to get the minimum cost in. You're not allowed, you can have a little bit of a wall here or a few trees there, but every tree has to be argued about. That's what I was told the first time I started talking about it. It's about looking at the long-term costs of if we carry on doing the things that we did through the 20th century or through the 19th century, of putting in the major infrastructure and then adding quality later on. It just doesn't work. Looking at a really holistic approach to development and change that would attract further inward investment, and looking at the lure of, you know, if we have a place that is wonderful, you think of the High Line. I mean, the income that's coming into New York because of the High Line far exceeds expectations. It's absolute goldmine. That's what you get if you create a quality environment. It also requires, as I've hinted at, a different attitude towards governance. So it's no longer thinking, well, I've got that piece of land, I want the highest building on there or the biggest or whatever, because I'm going to get maximum profit out of it. It's actually thinking, well, if we have this spatial vision for the city, for example, in Birmingham, then how can we actually share our aspirations? And so you share you work together. You share the risks, you share the costs, and you share the rewards. And it's working together holistically to achieve a different change. This project has received all sorts of support from not only from HS2 and from the government, but also from regional groupings such as the Canal and River Trust, and all sorts of people have become very interested. The Urban Land Institute are really interested in it, as well as the Thames Valley Wetlands and that sort of organisation. We've actually had support from Europe for PhD student. This is Anastasia, who is looking at the low carbon impact of or development consequences of large scale regional design. And the first thing really is to get to understand. First thing I did was to try and get to know the area, because although I've been living there for some time, I just didn't know the land that this railway line is going to go through. I don't know whether you can see it from the back, but it's that's Birmingham, that's Solihull, and this is Coventry, and this is the railway line that goes up through here, separates off, comes into Birmingham where there's going to be a station. There's going to be a station out here as well, and then it goes up to the north, up to Leeds and Manchester, and that was announced just a couple of days ago that they've agreed for it to go ahead. And so I thought I just need to know what's there, so contour map. So I spent the whole bank holiday weekend colouring in, as my husband said, which is actually to actually understand what was there. And much to my surprise, there were these two huge valleys, the Blythe Valley, which runs north-south, and the Tame Valley going across that way. So I said to him, let's go and have a look at this valley between Coventry and Birmingham. And he's born and bred in Birmingham. He said, what valley? He said, are you sure it still exists? And I said, yes, it does. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it does. And my student said, is there a valley there? And they travel along these roads that cross it and they've never noticed it either. It's completely unknown. It's isolated and forgotten. And if you look at the history of it, this is a very quick drawing. It shows that Birmingham is on an elevated plateau and that there's an aquifer that underlies it. And that's why Birmingham is where it is, because it was on high ground. You could have dry feet, you could set up manufacturing and draw abstract water from the aquifer below. Hardly any development no development really to speak of in the valley, which is one of the finest examples of lowland rolling countryside in the UK. And then in the Tame Valley, a series of, as is typical in many cities in the UK, the sewage beds were in the valley, and then they got pushed out further and further, and then gradually you have industry located there, and another huge project, which is a singular architectural project, such as Castle Vale, which is that red circle there. But all the infrastructure wraps around this plateau. That's what isolates the valley from the city, and within these valleys there's a legacy of decades of industrialisation. So although Spaghetti Junction looks quite impressive, somebody said to me once, is that what you're going to do with it? I said, no, that's it now. Because it looks great from above, but underneath it is really, really awful. And to mention Noel again, I said, come on, we want to go and have a look at underneath Spaghetti Junction. He said, why? Why is it that when other people say, let's go out somewhere, they go to nice places? And you take me to look at underneath Spaghetti Junction? It really is bizarre. Anyway, and then I began to think, this is the crap map, I still haven't got a better title for it, but I looked at the places that are stressed in the city, of environmental stress, of social stress, cultural stress, educational and employment, areas of low educational employment. And that's, it all follows the line of this infrastructure. Because the people in the north of the city up here, they can't get across down to here easily because the Tame Valley, it's almost impossible to get across there. All the roads have been blocked off. There's a massive road that crosses it, and that's about it. It's almost impossible to get into this valley. Nobody knows that it's there because you'd have to cross so many lanes of traffic to get there. And then that reduces the employment prospects, the educational prospects of the people who live either side of the valley. It creates health issues. And if you look at the long-term cost of that, in terms of the benefits that are paid to people because they can't get good jobs, they don't have access to the facilities of the city, I think that the cost is really significant. So the point I've been making to the government is that we can't afford to do this again. So anything that HS2, since HS2 is coming through there, what it needs to do is to put right some of those problems, not just exacerbate the whole thing. So I started doing these drawings. Now, these drawings are pretty crude. They're huge. They're A1 drawings. And I can't tell you how important that is, the drawings, because people find them unthreatening. They're not like, I know this is a PowerPoint, because we couldn't all fit around it. I haven't brought them with me, to be honest. But then people like to touch them and look at them and see where things are, and they're not finished. They're not perfect at all. But they're a way to have a discussion, a rhetorical aid. But this is beginning to look at what we could do. Perhaps we could have the railway line coming into a park. That's the size of Central Park in New York. Obviously, it's not going to be that big, but it makes the point the park we have at the moment is rather skinny. How about if we begin to pump up the water from the aquifer, put it through a whole series of retention pools, and then put the clean water back into the Trent network? If we have people from UNESCO said that if we wanted to have a skill for traditional knowledge, and these are usually in beautiful places like Fiji and Arizona, then they would come to Birmingham to see it. And I think the idea of having something like that in Birmingham seems absolutely remarkable. But then the whole thing is about creating accessibility, making sure that any intervention improves mobility and accessibility around the city and through into the valley structure. And this is a more tidied up version that went to the Secretary of State about a year ago, more or less says the same thing. So what does it really mean? raising aspirations, thinking about how both of those valleys could be centres for European destinations and possibly for New Zealand as well. To think about how we could actually, to really make the point that you have to have this long-term aspiration, I did say, well, how about that we could actually drink bottled water from the Tame? At the moment, you can smell it before you see it. So the idea of doing that, somebody shouted out once when I was saying that, after you, Kathryn. So, the whole agenda is around jobs and skills, thinking about the valleys as a resource for the city to help us to do with the food security issue, for example, market gardening and intensive horticultural production. At the moment, the valley is pretty degraded in terms of its agricultural land because of all the subsidies that we get from Europe. So why not think about it in terms of food security? How about rediscovering the traditional skills as well as developing new skills in terms of horticulture and agriculture? Having Birmingham as a really thriving art and design and digital media creative sector, so we could have a showcase for that in the valley, as well as providing all sorts of opportunities for local entrepreneurship and accommodation. Really thinking about a new way of urban living, that instead of turning its back to the valley system, actually addressing it, making it visible. The valleys themselves, actually somebody said to me about further down to the south, that's where the railway line goes through the Chilterns, and somebody came up to me and said, well, we're going through the Chilterns, I think we're going to have something like 3 billion cubic metres of chalk, of stuff that comes out of the ground. I said we can sell about a third of that because it's going to be good quality, but that leaves us with two-thirds of the stuff is not really very good. Can we put it in one of your valleys? I said, no, you can't. But we could use those valleys for fishing, for recreation, for leisure. We could store water in the valleys. We've got more water. I know you've got loads of water here, but we haven't got as much water as you have. But we have got more than they have in the south, so we could store water there, sell it to the south. We can use the fact that the railway line's coming in to put in the digital infrastructure, to put in weather monitoring, meteorological monitoring, to actually have a national network. And then absolutely to look at the mobility issues, to make sure that mobility is increased at every opportunity, to make sure that people walk more, people stay longer in the city, and that they cycle more. And that's key, introducing pedestrian bridges, creating this new identity, because Birmingham, up until, I don't know, again, you might not know, but up until recently it had a really terrible reputation. That's changed quite a bit, but there are these vestiges of a poor reputation left, so we want to be able to change that, to think about the city boundary, for example. This is the city on this plateau in the distance, looking from the Tame Valley. Instead of the planning talk of softening edges, or the landscape talk about softening edges, I think edges should be really striking and evident. So perhaps we should have a whole line of wind turbines across the top of the plateaus and this replenished valley underneath. And so what it's becoming is a way that is a strategy at the highest level. It has to work at the highest level to actually lead and shape employment, housing, health, tourism, food, and cultural strategies. It's a way to give it a spatial identity and to lead those other strategies, and as well as take into account other major developments that are happening. I started to work on I've published an article for Railway Terminal World. I don't know if any of you read it. I hadn't heard of it. And Noel said to me, why are you writing about stations? Well, I was writing about stations because they asked me what landscape could do to mediate the impact of the stations in Birmingham. So, of course, I turned that round to think, well, what could the station do for the city of Birmingham? How, if we have this spatial strategy, how can we use this massive intervention to shape the public realm, to shape the public strategy, the spatial strategy for the city, as well as resolve the problems? And I went to see the head of HS2, David Higgins, who had seen the proposals, the current proposals for the stations, and he just said, why does it look like this? Because it's the proposals aren't particularly, they're just a diagram really to explain this is where the station is why isn't the station invisible? Why don't you have all this development? This is from Hudson's Yards in New York, where, again, an off-spin from the High Line. But look at the amount of development they're proposing. 5,000 residences, 14 acres of parkland within that, and shops and office blocks. So that the station is seen as a major resource for regeneration, not just something that's stuck in, again, and you have to try and get into. So that's beginning to have a different debate about the stations, and I've been showing people this is Seattle, the station in Seattle or in Rotterdam that's just opened, to begin to think of different ways of working with the station as part of the city, as part of progressively improving the city, rather than something that we have to deal with for years and decades to come if it's just plonked in the way the railway engineers are thinking about it, because that's the way they have been thinking about it. How we can get amazing entrances to come into the city as the railway slows down, ensuring, again, looking outwards rather than just thinking about the construction of the railway. What do you see when you look out? And at the moment, this is Liège, but at the moment there is a great view of the city as you come in, because it's on an elevated viaduct. But of course, nobody's really thinking about that yet. But we should maintain that view. We should exaggerate the view. Thinking about how it might come into a much larger park than the current park. The park is quite skinny, as I mentioned. Currently, the station is due to come in at about 40 metres above ground. I don't really know why. But that would if that was all built on, that would put the park completely, literally in the shade, which means that it's not anywhere near as valuable as it could be. And so part of this aspiration raising and challenging and questioning, I've went to Antwerp station, where they've got 3 lines of railways, the high-speed, regional and local trains stacked on top of each other, with a building that's publicly accessible all the way around, where the light comes right the way down into the centre. That's astonishing. It's absolutely incredible. And that's what happens when people come in. They've got these amazing views. And this is all part of changing the identity, changing the region. So ensuring that the stations actually contribute to the quality of life. We've got a New Street station in Birmingham, was built in the 60s, 70s, after it was bombed in the war. And it's just awful. And they're redeveloping it now, and it still is such a problem in the blight that it creates around it. We want to really avoid that. Birmingham is known as a city of 1,000 trades, so why can't we have a station coming in to a city of 1,000 parks and squares? And how can we think about working to create memorable walks through the city? Because the centre, where it's coming in, it's a bit like Spaghetti Junction. It's sort of in the middle of all these different zones, how all these zones we always think of, and where these all meet, there's like a no man's land, even the city. So the students have been out and have made a video of it, and we're using that as the basis for projects in the next year as well, across the school. Balancing ponds, where people are just wringing their hands thinking, where are we going to put the balancing ponds? There's going to be so much water. So why not use them as the basis for high quality ecological housing, high density housing in the city centre? Really crucially, it's about looking how this can also contribute to regional health strategies by prioritising cyclists over cars. Now, Birmingham was built on the car industry, so it's quite a difficult step we're getting there, but to think about cyclists are really important. They should take priority, as should pedestrians. And so this is also part of what we're trying to achieve through the whole project in the valleys as well as in the city centre, and thinking about how it could also, the structures and the infrastructure could be used to create a new cultural and arts strategy. And so really all of this is about energising the city. At the moment in Birmingham, the only place that you can sit in is the Cathedral Square, where the very big centre of the city, where kids sit on the chairs and on the gravestones and all that sort of thing. Otherwise, you've got to pay to sit down and have a cup of coffee. Why should we have that? We want people to stay longer. So that means creating places for people to hold events without having to pay for it. Massive events and little events. How we can exploit views from the surrounding topography to look at the railway line, as well as create an amazing view as people come in, because it will be slowing down, not going at full speed. And I was taken to the Norwegian Public Road Authority a couple of years ago, and I thought, why am I going there? But it sounded rather dry. But actually, they've got in their legislation, any infrastructure that's carried out by the Norwegian Public Road Authority must not, by law, detract in any way from the landscape in any way, and wherever possible should add beauty. And I think that's a really good thing to go with. It makes engineers go bit pale when you mention that, but it's quite a good line. And understanding the responsibility that we have, that landscape is the child of history and that there is an extraordinary legacy. What we're talking about is a huge project. This is a pilot. What is a pilot for? It might be a pilot for the whole of the UK, but it can't just be this linear project. It could be like Eden 2. It could be a massive project from London right up to Scotland, where you use this intervention to engage with all these communities that are going to be impacted along the route and actually get something really positive out of it. We're using it in the studio, and this is the work of some of my students from last year. And they actually operating at 1 to 30,000, it takes a bit getting used to, but they do that, and then they work to exploring ideas. We've reduced the station by half. We're working across the red lines and all that sort of thing. How long have I got? Am I all right? Keep going? Okay. So, as I said, it's found tremendous support so far. I am hoping that it will be used as a pilot. I should be finding out in November whether it is or not, as one of the 6 key studies that will be used as examples by HS2 to test their design vision, which they're currently looking at. That would be tremendous if it happens. And then I wanted to look at another project just very briefly, and this is Thurrock. Now, the man who took me out for a cup of coffee every 2 weeks left after 6 months. That's why we only went out for 6 months. And 3 weeks after he moved to Thurrock, he phoned me up. He said, "Kathryn, we need you down here. This place is so weird." And I didn't know where Thurrock was when he first said he was going down there. I thought it was up in Scotland, but it's not. It's actually on the Thames. And Thurrock is a very strange place. It is weird. It's one of the few places I know where industrial land is actually more expensive than residential land, because nobody really wants to live there. Lots of people do live there and they're intensely proud, but nobody would really want to move there. And it's been used as the rubbish dump for London for centuries. When the graveyards got full in London, they dug the bodies up, the bones up, and took them to Thurrock and dumped them on the riverside. It used to be the place where all the food was produced, a lot of agricultural production. It was taken into London at the end of the afternoon, and then the night soil was brought back at the end of the day by horse cart to fertilise the land. It's no longer like that. This is not a collage. This is Procter & Gamble on the right and a beautiful church on the left. They are literally cheek by jowl. And this is a really great quote by Jonathan Meades. "You're dogged by utilitarian grandeur, structural rawness, by industry in its nudity, by mostly unwitting sublimity, by the forms of might." And that is what it is really like. It's rather unknown. I didn't know it. It has the Queen Elizabeth, the QE2 bridge that goes across part of the M25, which you might have, if you've been to the UK, you might have been stuck on for several hours. And so it has a very low, it's had, up until recently, really low expectations. That when I've got a pile of reports of work that's been carried out by all sorts of people over the last decade or so, at great expense, none of which have made any difference to the place. And so I needed to think of a way that could actually change the mindset. not just of the officers, but of the people who are leading the council, of the politicians, so that there is, to break out this cycle of we can't do that, because it's easy to find hundreds of reasons why you can never do anything. The river there, people hadn't really looked at the river very much, because you can see here, this is the river wall that goes along, because there were huge floods in 53 and lots of people died, and it was obviously absolutely devastating. But you've got this wall that separates the town from the river, and so when you look down from the town you can't see the river at all. This is the yacht club, and I was told when I first went there that it was going to be sold for, I think it was £80,000. I thought, really? I'll have it. I'll get it. I haven't got £80,000, but I would have found it if I could, but of course I couldn't because I was working for them. So it was, and now it's about £250,000. So because we've started to up the ante, we've started to change the way people think about Thurrock. The reason why all of this has happened is because they've got new leadership, people who are determined to make a change, determined that as London goes further eastwards, it doesn't just leap over Thurrock and go to the next borough because nobody wants to go there. Determined that as the development goes through, it doesn't turn Thurrock into something that's suburban like the rest of the towns that surround London, but actually tries to retain and emphasise some of its really unique qualities, which are odd but absolutely extraordinary. Then there are problems. The grey areas are, broadly speaking, where people live. The pink areas are all the landfill sites and the buffer zones, which really got me stuck because they've got to fit, yes, I forgot to mention this, they've got to fit 25,500 houses in the borough, and the politicians at the moment are saying we're full. We can't have any more. But you've got, in addition to the buffer zones, you've got all those pink areas, these are landfill sites on former marshland. This is a new port where there's going to be 40,000 traffic movements every day going past these villages. The pollution that will come from that is quite extraordinary, I think. You've got another port at Tilbury Port, you might have heard of it, and then there's Greenbelt. And then you've got high-pressure gas lines and massive electricity cables and pylons. And I just thought, how are we going to do anything here? So how can we reinvent it? So I've used the same approach with HS2 to think about providing an overarching landscape vision for Thurrock, to begin to think, well, actually the area, this is a fenland basin that's currently drained to provide low-grade agriculture. This is, broadly speaking, this is the London terrace, the final London terrace that goes across England. A lot of it's been dug out for chalk, and one of the quarries that has been dug out is full of a shopping centre at the moment. You've got this river that comes, the Thames, which is such an extraordinary asset. Simon Sharma describes it as liquid history. And there's the potential to change the relationship of the borough to the river, actually get people to look to Kent instead of going like that. Kent's across the river, we don't have anything to do with it. Actually begin to work together to develop the region and the river infrastructure around it. And begin to think about, well, instead of being the dustbin of London, how about seeing it as the entrance to the North Sea? And it was really quite difficult to find a map of the North Sea because it's usually the UK and then the Atlantic, or Europe and the Mediterranean. And, so in the end, well, this is actually from Tom Holbrook's fifth studio, because he was interested in it as well. What about if we begin to develop with the communities around the North Sea a new economic and social and cultural connections, and that would build on something called the Cool Sea strategy that was funded by EU money a few years ago. Take it forward. How about if we have a new approach to housing rather than the suburban housing that would make it lose its extraordinary qualities? Look at the Silo Dam from Amsterdam. I think there are about, I can't remember the figures now, it's 20 metres, I think there's about 257 flats in that block. And if you looked at it per hectare, if they had something like 34 of these blocks, they'd solve their housing problem. They could be in the river. You don't actually need to build on the land. I don't think I'll get away with that at all, but it's sort of quite an interesting idea. And then I thought, well, the best thing to do, really, the best thing I could imagine to actually change the level of confidence is to build your own house. And so I got John Qualley from the University of Virginia to come over and give a talk to the directors and the politicians about prefabricated housing. Now, prefab housing has a bad reputation, from after the war, but actually these are beautiful. These are just astonishingly beautiful houses and very cheap. And so we're getting those translated into British standards so that we can use them. And then I thought, well, that's partly what I've been doing, is to get experts coming in. Dirk Simons from the Netherlands, who was responsible for a huge project there called Making Room for the River, taking the boundaries of the river, the floodplain, flood walls, further back to allow the marshlands to operate as a sponge more, so you reduce the problems of flooding further upstream or downstream, depending which way the tide's going. We've had John Thurrock from UVA, had the former mayor of Copenhagen, Klaus Bondum, who came over to talk about cycling as part of city building. And so to bring it all together, we had to have some sort of diagram. So I thought, well, okay, the Environment Agency is going to maintain the flood defences up to this point, which is Tilbury Port. Instead of thinking, what they're doing at the moment is a piecemeal approach. We can fit some houses in here, we might be able to get 20 there, 15 there. It just takes it's just so difficult to think about where you could fit anything in. How about if you look at what we want to achieve in the long term in 15, 25 years' time? And so this I couldn't believe that I was actually going to do it. I know it doesn't look very dramatic, but it is actually quite radical, because I was thinking, okay, well, this could be the inhabited floodplain. This is where we could build housing that is absolutely flood-proofed. We could perhaps think about Tilbury Port as a place for people to live. This darker blue area is where we could take the flood walls back and create green rivers and actually create these areas to hold more water when in times of flood. And we could actually begin to think, well, instead of the green belt is around the edges here, it's really right up to the existing housing. Perhaps we really should begin to think about changing the green belt, actually not just, which a lot, is quite a radical idea to undertake, and then thinking about making another railway so that you have a loop that goes around the fenland. You could possibly build in some areas across here so that people, I'm not talking about massive housing areas, but to at least begin to look at the Fenland Basin, to begin to build on here, so where you can have great views of the river, so that you can actually make this connection between the river and create a sense of pride of the place where people live, based on its topography. And this is a further iteration of the same idea, which is being debated at Directors' Board, or has been this week. So, thinking about the river as an asset, I'm not suggesting that we use this because that obviously is further north than Thurrock, but it's to realise that actually a view is incredibly valuable. How can we do that? To go back to, this is taken from Jan Gehl's work in Copenhagen. It's the same, similar to the thing I was talking about in Birmingham. How do we make more urban life for more people? How do we get people to walk more and cycle more? And if those are the terms of engagement, whether you're a landscape architect, or an engineer, a developer, a politician, you think at the beginning, at the first point, how do you actually improve these statistics, get more people to walk? And from those very broad statistics that are being agreed at director level, then there are a number of key targets that come from that. And Thurrock was actually identified, apparently men in Thurrock over the age of 45 are the unhappiest in the UK. So I've got, one of the things that I put down is that the happiness score for men aged over 45 should be increased by 10% each year. And again, some wag in the audience said, then how are you going to do that again, Kathryn? Well, I don't know. But these are things that if we measure very simple target, I'm not saying that happiness is a simple target, but things like how many people eat fresh food once a day, how many people grow vegetables, how many kids learn to swim, learn to sail. If we get that base data and then we can measure them year by year, they are cross-disciplinary. They are the remit of housing, planning, health, and education, each of the directorates that are there. So all of this really, all that I've been talking about is about aesthetics from a different point of view, not a Kantian point of view, but actually from a way that actually looks at the physical, social, cultural context of our lives. The drawings that I've shown you have been exhibited, and people are quite interested in the impact they have. Anastasia, my PhD student, was very sceptical when I just asked them about the drawings. She thought, she's just doing the drawings because she can't use CAD, which is true, but they have a value in themselves. I'm thinking about, obviously, another book. I haven't told Lol that here, and he's here today. Lol, I'm thinking of another book, Master Planning and Aesthetics, and also there's a potential for a TV series, but the Greeks got it wrong. I think this, in educational terms, this gives us a new way of looking at new courses, because there are lots of courses on master planning currently in Europe and across and in North America, but a lot of them from an architectural point of view, and that lacks that geographic sensibility and that landscape sensibility that is so important to actually really connect these plans to places. And I think also we've been talking about non-traditional PhDs that actually begin, if designing is seen as a critical endeavour, as I've said before, any part of it is open to investigation, and that means any part of the process can become the focus for PhD studies. And then just to conclude, these people are journalists waiting for the opening of Martha Schwartz's project a couple of years ago in China. And landscape architecture is massively increasing in popularity. Less so in the UK. In the Netherlands, I understand there are more landscape architects applying for courses than architects. In China, in Nanjing, I was told there are 13 universities that teach landscape architecture just in one city. And recently, a group of people came over to see us from China, and they just wanted to talk about landscape architecture. So there's a real cusp of a change happening, and that's what I think we need to take the most of and really go forward. Thank you very much. Yeah, sure.
We've got a couple of minutes for questions if anybody would like to ask questions.
I'm sorry.
Questions?
They all want to go. They've all
Okay,
got
just
to go.
before you go, I'd like to ask Gavin to thank Kathryn for us.
Okay. Shall I go and sit down? Shall I go and sit down?
Yes. Yeah.
I didn't fall over.
Okay, thanks, Kathryn. I just noted some points going through your talk that I've jotted down, which I'll just run through. The power of ideas. What do ideas look like? Looking beyond discipline and institutional boundaries. Looking to the broader geographic and social and economic context to design, and thinking in a bigger scale. The importance of design leadership and advocacy, and the importance of coffee and kind of persistence. The need to have a long time view. The significance of the everyday places and everyday landscapes. And the importance of having high expectations. And I think finally, the economic opportunities that come from design, the examples that you gave of the economic spin-off that's come through these iconic projects. And I think in terms of that last one, that strikes a chord in some of our infrastructure projects. So for instance, our transport agency here has adopted a business case strategy. In practice, that seems to mean a lower cost approach, a kind of a race to the bottom. And I think your message is that if it's looked at in the bigger picture, a business case strategy should be a race to the top. So thank you for giving us the benefit of your experience, and I think in particular the benefit of your vision and your big picture. Thank you.